Chapter 3. Doomsday, 1070–1087, the Papist Reformation of the English Church. And so we come to the last act of the tragic drama, the false Pope's seal on the whole of what had gone before. In the week after Pascha, writes Thierry, there arrived in England, pursuant to William's request, 3 legates from the Apostolic See, vizamin Ermenfeni, Bishop of Siena, and the cardinals John and Peter. The Norman founded his great designs on the presence of these envoys from his ally the Pope, and kept them about him for a whole year, honouring them, says an old historian, as if they had been angels of God. In the midst of the famine, which in many places was destroying the Saxons by thousands, brilliant festivals were celebrated in the fortified palace of Winchester. There the Roman priests, placing the crown afresh on the head of the foreign king, effaced the vain malediction which Eldred Aldred, Archbishop of York, had pronounced against him. After the festivals, a great assembly of the Normans, laymen or priests, enriched by the lands of the English, was held at Winchester. At this assembly, the Saxons were summoned to appear, in the name of the authority of the Roman Church, by circulars, the style of which might forewarn them of the result of this great council, as it was called, to themselves. Although the Church of Rome, said the envoys, has a right to watch the conduct of all Christians, it more especially belongs to her to inquire into your morals and way of life, you whom she formerly instructed in the faith of Christ, and to repair in you the decay of that faith which you hold from her. In order to exercise over your person this salutary inspection, we, ministers of blessed Peter the Apostle, and authorized representatives of our Lord Pope Alexander, have resolved to hold a council with you, that we may inform ourselves of the bad things which have sprung up in the vineyard of the Lord, and may plant in it things profitable both for the body and for the soul. The true sense of these mystical words was that the conqueror, in accordance with the Pope, wished to strip the whole body of the higher clergy of English origin, and the mission of the legates from Rome was to give the colour of religion to a measure purely political. The prelate whom they first struck was Stigand, Archbishop of Canterbury, who had dared to appear in arms against the foreigner and had refused to anoint him king. These were his real crimes, but the sentence which degraded him was grounded on other causes, on more honest pretexts, to use the language of the old historians. 3 ecclesiastical grievances were found against him, which rendered his ordination null and void. He was turned out of the episcopacy, first, for having taken the archbishopric during the life of the Norman Archbishop Robert, whom the Saxons had driven away. Secondly, for having said Mass in the pontifical habit or pallium worn by the said Robert, and left by him at Canterbury. Lastly, for having received his own pallium from the hands of Benedict X, who had been degraded and afterwards excommunicated by a victorious competitor. As soon as the friend of King Harold and of his country was, according to the language of the time, struck by the canonical axe, his lands were seized and divided between the Norman king, the Norman queen, and the Bishop of Bayeux. The same blow was aimed at those English bishops who could not be reproached with any violation of the canons. Alexander, prelate of Lincoln, Egelmar, prelate of East Anglia, Egelric, prelate of Sussex, several other bishops, and the abbots of the principal monasteries, were degraded all at once. When the sentence of degradation was pronounced against them, they were compelled to swear on the gospel that they considered themselves as deprived of their dignities lawfully and forever, and that, whoever their successors might be, they would not protest against them. They were then conducted by an armed guard into some fortress or monastery, which became their prison. Those who had formerly been monks were forcibly taken back to their old cloisters, and it was officially published that, disgusted with the world, it had pleased them to go and revisit the friends of their youth. Thus it was that foreign power mingled derision with violence. The members of the Saxon clergy dared not to struggle against their fate. Stigand fled into Scotland. Egilsig, an abbot of St. Augustine's, embarked for Denmark and was demanded as a fugitif du roi by a rescript from the conqueror. Only one bishop, Aegilwyn, Ethelwyn of Durham, when on the point of departing into exile, solemnly cursed the oppressors of his country and declared them separated forever from the communion of Christians, according to the grave and gloomy formula in which that separation was pronounced. But the sound of these words fell in vain on the ear of the Norman. William had priests to give the lie to priests, as he had swords to ward off swords. Ethelwyn, who, as we have seen, joined Hereward at Ely, but was captured and died of hunger in prison at Abingdon, was not the only bishop to defy the papists. His brother Ethelric, who had retired as Bishop of Durham in 1056 to make way for his brother, was brought from Peterborough, condemned for piracy, and imprisoned in Westminster Abbey. There he lived for 2 more years, in voluntary poverty and a wealth of tears, and was never reconciled with William. He died on October 15th, 1072, was buried in the chapel of St. Nicholas, and was very soon considered a saint, miracles being wrought at his tomb. For those who had known him when living, writes William of Malmesbury, transmitted his memory to their children, and to this day neither visitors nor supplicants are wanting at his tomb. Having silenced the last true bishops, the papists now turned to the monks. Few were those, like Frederick of St. Albans, who resisted them. Among the few were 3 who occupied a dependency of Ely's at St. Neots, Huntingdonshire. When the Norman Gilbert of Clara came to expel them, they refused to move, and could not be expelled either by hunger or the lash. Finally, they were physically transported across the Channel to the Norman monastery of Bec, where they remained in prison, as far as we can surmise, to the end of their lives. In 1083, it was the turn of the most venerable of England's holy places, Glastonbury, to suffer the ravages of the Christian pagans. The occasion was an argument between the monks and their new Norman abbot, Thurston, who insisted on substituting a new form of chanting from Dijon for the old-style Gregorian chanting to which the monks were accustomed. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that the monks made an amicable complaint to him, Thurston, about it, and asked him to rule them justly and have regard for them, and in return they would be faithful and obedient to him. The abbot, however, would have none of it, but treated them badly, threatening them with worse. One day the abbot went into the chapter and spoke against the monks and threatened to maltreat them. He sent for laymen who entered the chapter fully armed against the monks. Not knowing what they should do, the monks were terrified and fled in all directions. Some ran into the church and locked the doors against them, but their pursuers went after them into the monastic church, determined to drag them out since they were afraid to leave. Moreover, a pitiful thing took place there that day, when the Frenchmen broke into the choir and began pelting the monks in the direction of the altar where they were. Some of the men-at-arms climbed up to the gallery and shot arrows down into the sanctuary, so that many arrows stuck in the cross which stood above the altar. The wretched monks lay around the altar, and some crept underneath, crying aloud to God, desperately imploring his mercy when none was forthcoming from men. What more can we find to say except to add that they showered arrows, and their companions brocade down the doors to force an entrance, and struck down and killed some of the monks, wounding many therein, so that their blood ran down from the altar onto the steps, and from the steps onto the floor. 3 of the monks were done to death, and 18 wounded. William of Malmesbury adds that the Glastonbury monks refused to accept the chant of William of Fécamp because they had grown up in the practice of the Roman Church. This shows that the Old English Church preserved the old traditions of Orthodox Rome, which had now been superseded on the continent. Again, William writes that one of the arrows pierced an image of the crucified Lord, which suddenly gushed blood. At this sight, the perpetrator of the crime became unbearably confused and at once became mad, so that when he got outside the church he fell to the ground, broke his neck, and died. As soon as the others saw this, they hastened to leave the monastery, lest they should suffer similar punishments. But the rod of divine justice did not allow them to escape retribution, since it knew that they had been accomplices in the perpetration of evil. For some were affected internally, and some externally, either their minds or their bodies being rendered impotent, and they paid a just penalty. Thus did the Normans dare to do what even the pagan Saxons and Danes had not dared, to defile the oldest and holiest shrine of Britain, the meeting place in Christ of Jew and Greek, Roman and Celt, Saxon and Dane. Even the holy relics of the English saints were subjected to desecration. For, as Thierry writes, the hatred which the clergy of the conquest bore to the natives of England extended to the saints of English birth, and in different places their tombs were broken open and their bones scattered about. Thus Archbishop Lanfranc refused to consider St. Alphege of Canterbury a hieromartyr, although the truth of his martyrdom was witnessed by his incorrupt body, and he demoted St. Dunstan's Day to the rank of a third-class feast and reformed certain other feasts of the English Church. However, the English saints were not inactive in their own defence. In 1077, the monastery of Evesham passed into the control of a Norman abbot named Walter, who, on the advice of Lanfranc, decided to subject the local saints' relics to ordeal by fire. But not only did the holy relics not burn, the fire even refused to touch them. Moreover, when Walter was carrying the skull of the holy martyr Prince Wistan, it suddenly fell from his hands and began gushing out a river of sweat. And when they came to the relics of St. Credon, an 8th century abbot of Evesham, they were all terrified to see them shining as gold. Then the monks of Evesham, heartened, went on the offensive. They took the relics of their major saint, Bishop Egwin of Worcester, on a fundraising tour of the country, during which miracles were reported as far afield as Oxford, Dover, Winchester, and the River Trent. Another such incident is recorded by John Hudson. Possibly in the middle of the 12th century, a writer at Abingdon, Berkshire, described with great relish the fate of the monastery's first new abbot after the conquest, Adelelm, a monk from Jumièges. The abbot displayed a marked disrespect for pre-conquest saints, notably planning to replace the church built by St. Æthelwold. Once, while dining with his relatives and friends, Adelelm was abusing Æthelwold, saying that the Church of English rustic should not stand but be destroyed. After the meal he left to relieve himself, and there cried out. Those who came running found him dead. Clearly the writer saw such a death as fitting. In the decades that followed, the discoveries of the incorrupt relics of several English saints proved the sanctity of the old traditions, leading to a restoration of their veneration in the Anglo-Norman Church. These saints included St. Mildburga at Much Wenlock in 1079, St. Theodore at Canterbury in 1091, St. Edmund at Bury St. Edmunds in 1095, St. Edward the Confessor at Westminster in 1102, St. Cuthbert at Durham in 1104, St. Alphege at Canterbury in 1105, and St. Etheldrada at Ely in 1106. Gradually, however, as the pre-revolutionary days of Anglo-Saxon England receded, or rather were violently blotted out, from the popular memory, the old traditions were lost. William of Malmesbury could still write, early in the 12th century, "Does not the whole island blaze with so many relics that you can scarcely pass a village of any consequence without hearing the name of some new saint?" But then he added, "And of how many have all records perished?" But all this could have been borne if only the English themselves had kept their faith and their membership of the one true church. However, on August 29th, 1070, the day of the beheading of St. John the Forerunner, and a strict fast day in the Orthodox Church, the first Roman Catholic Archbishop of Canterbury, Lanfranc of Bec, was consecrated in the place of Stigand. Truly the forerunners of Christ, the preachers of repentance, had fallen in England. Immediately, Lanfranc demanded, and eventually obtained, a profession of obedience from the Archbishop-elect of York, Thomas, in spite of the fact that York had been a separate ecclesiastical province throughout the history of the English Church. The Anglo-Saxon text of the Parker text of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle ends at this point, continuing in Latin. For truly, the English Church had now become Latin both in language and in theology. Lanfranc also set about reforming the canon law of the English Church to bring it into line with the new code of the Roman papacy. In this he received the full support of William, who said, "I have ordained that the episcopal laws be amended, because before my time they were not properly administered in England according to the precepts of the holy canons." These canons, which had already been put into effect in Normandy and other parts of Western Europe, concerned such matters as the respect due to the Roman see, simony, the separation of secular and ecclesiastical courts, and the marriage of the clergy. It was the latter decree that caused the greatest disturbance, both on the continent and in England. And sadly, we find the English Bishop Wulfstan on the side of the uncanonical onslaught on holy matrimony. Thus we read that, "The sin of incontinence he abhorred, and approved continence in all men, and especially in clerks in holy orders. If he found one wholly given to chastity, he took him to himself, and loved him as a son. Wedded priests he brought under one edict, commanding them to renounce their fleshly desires or their churches. If they loved chastity, they would remain and be welcome. If they were the servants of bodily pleasures, they must go forth in disgrace. Some there were who chose rather to go without their churches than their women, and of these some wandered about till they starved, others sought and at last found some other provision." For his obedience to the king and strict enactment of the papal decrees, Wulfstan received great honour from the world's mighty ones, and by the 1080s he was one of the very few bishops of English origin still in possession of their sees. But we can only lament the fall of a great ascetic and wonder-worker, who was reduced to separating by force those whom God had lawfully joined together. If only he had paid heed to the true canons accepted by the 7 ecumenical councils on the marriage of the clergy. If only he had paid heed to the correspondence of the great 8th century English apostle of Germany, St. Boniface, in which he would have read that Pope Zachariah, in a letter to Boniface, upheld the marriage of priests. And even if the English Church in its latest phase did at times declare against the marriage of priests, as in Ethelred's Code of 1008, at other times it was explicitly permitted, as in Archbishop Wulfstan's Law of Northumbrian Priests, and never were lawfully married priests forced to separate from their wives in pre-conquest England. But there was an unbalanced streak in Wulfstan's asceticism, which combined an almost Manichaean zeal for chastity with some surprising improprieties. And he had a papist understanding of obedience that ignored the word, "Neither is a wicked king any longer a king, but a tyrant, nor is a bishop oppressed with ignorance a bishop, but falsely so called." However, it must be said in Wulfstan's favour that once, during a synod held at Westminster in the king's presence, he defied Lanfranc's order that he give up his pastoral staff and ring on the grounds that he was supposedly an ignorant and unlearned man. The story is told by Aelred of Rievaulx, in Cardinal Newman's paraphrase, that he rose up and said that he would give up his staff only to King Edward the Confessor, who had conferred it upon him. With these words he raised his hand a little, and drove the crozier into the stone which covered the sacred body. "Take this, my master," he said, "and deliver it to whom thou will." And descending from the altar, he laid aside his pontifical dress and took his seat, a simple monk, among the monks. But the staff, to the wonder of all, remained fast embedded in the stone. They tried to draw it out, but it was immovable. A murmur ran through the throne. They crowded round the spot in astonishment, and you might see them in their surprise, approaching a little, then stopping, stretching out their hands and withdrawing them, now throwing themselves on the floor to see how the spike was fastened in the stone, now rising up and gathering into little groups to gaze. The news was carried to where the synod was sitting. Lanfranc sent the Bishop of Rochester to the tomb to bring the staff, but was unable to withdraw it. The Archbishop, in wonder, sent for the king and went with him to the place, and after having prayed, tried to move it, but in vain. The king cried out, and Lanfranc burst into tears. When the Archbishop had withdrawn his deposition, Wulfstan withdrew the staff from the tomb. The Gregorian Revolution. Who was the real ruler of the English Church at this time, William or the Pope? In order to answer that question, we need to turn to the revolution in church-state relations that was taking place on the continent of Europe. At almost the same time that the English autocracy was being destroyed, the Byzantine Empire suffered a disastrous defeat at the hands of the Seljuk Turks, Manzikert, in 1071. Most of Anatolia, the heartland of Byzantine strength, was conceded to the Turks. In the same year, the last Byzantine stronghold in southern Italy, Bari, fell to the Normans, after which Byzantium was never again able to exert significant influence on events in the West. As Orthodox autocracy reeled under these hammer blows from east and west, a new form of despotism, Christian in form but pagan in essence, entered upon the scene. Canning writes, "The impact of Gregory VII's pontificate was enormous. For the Church, nothing was to be the same again. From his active lifetime can be traced the settling of the Church in its long-term direction as a body of power and coercion, the character of the papacy as a jurisdictional and governmental institution. There arises the intrusive thought, out of bounds for the historian. This was the moment of the great wrong direction taken by the papacy, one which was to outlast the Middle Ages and survive into our own day. From the time of Gregory can be dated the deliberate clericalization of the Church based on the notion that the clergy, being morally purer, were superior to the laity and constituted a church which was Catholic, chaste and free. There was a deep connection between power and a celibacy, which helped distinguish the clergy as a separate and superior caste, distanced in the most profound psychological sense from the family concerns of the laity beneath them. At the time of the Reform papacy, the Church became stamped with characteristics which have remained those of the Roman Catholic Church. It became papally centered, legalistic, coercive, and clerical. The Roman Church was, in Gregory's words, the mother and mistress, mater et magistra, of all churches. Hildebrand, Pope Gregory VII, was a midget in physical size. But having been elected to the papacy by the will of St. Peter in 1073, he set about ensuring that no ruler on earth would rival him in grandeur. Having witnessed the Emperor Henry III's deposition of Pope Gregory VI, with whom he went into exile, he took the name Gregory VII in order to emphasize a unique mission. As Peter de Rosa writes, he had seen an emperor dethrone a pope. He would dethrone an emperor regardless. Had he put an emperor in his place, he would have been beyond reproach. He did far more. By introducing a mischievous and heretical doctrine of church-state relations, he put himself in place of the emperor. He claimed to be not only Bishop of Bishops, but King of Kings. In a parody of the Gospels, the devil took him up to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world, and Gregory VII exclaimed, "These are all mine." As that most objective of historians, Henry Charles Lear, wrote in the Inquisition in the Middle Ages, to the realization of this ideal of papal supremacy, he devoted his life with a fiery zeal and unshaken purpose that shrank from no obstacle, and to it he was ready to sacrifice not only the men who stood in his path, but also the immutable principles of truth and justice. The Bishop of Trier saw the danger. He charged Gregory with destroying the unity of the Church. The Bishop of Verdun said that the Pope was mistaken in his unheard-of arrogance. Belief belongs to one's church, the heart belongs to one's country. The Pope, he said, must not filch the heart's allegiance. This was precisely what Gregory did. He wanted all. He left emperors and princes nothing. The papacy, as he fashioned it, by undermining patriotism, undermined the authority of secular rulers. They felt threatened by the altar. At the Reformation, in England and elsewhere, rulers felt obliged to exclude Catholicism from their lands in order to feel secure. The changes Gregory brought about were reflected in the language. Before him, the Pope's traditional title was Vicar of St. Peter. After him, it was Vicar of Christ. Only Vicar of Christ could justify his absolutist pretensions, which his successors inherited in reality not from Peter or from Jesus, but from him. Gregory's position was based on a forged collection of canons and a false interpretation of two gospel passages, Matthew 16:18-19 and John 21:15-17. According to the first passage, in Gregory's interpretation, he was the successor of Peter, upon whom the Church had been founded, and had plenary power to bind and to loose. And, according to the second, the flock of Peter over which he had jurisdiction included all Christians, not excluding emperors. As he wrote, "Perhaps the supporters of the emperor imagine that when God commended his church to Peter 3 times, saying, 'Feed my sheep,' he made an exception of kings. Why do they not consider, or rather confess with shame, that when God gave Peter, as the ruler, the power of binding and loosing in heaven and on earth, he accepted no one and withheld nothing from his power? For who could doubt that the priests of Christ are considered the fathers and masters of kings, princes, and all the faithful? This meant that he had power both to excommunicate and depose the emperor. Nor did the emperor's anointing give him any authority in Gregory's eyes, for greater power is conceded to an exorcist when he is made a spiritual emperor for expelling demons than could be given to any layman for secular domination. Indeed, who would not know that kings and dukes took their origin from those who, ignorant of God, through pride, rapine, perfidy, murders, and finally almost any kind of crime, at the instigation of the devil, the prince of this world, sought with blind desire and unbearable presumption to dominate their equals, namely, other men. Hildebrand's attitude to political power was almost Manichaean in its negative intensity. Indeed, as de Rosa writes of a later pope who faithfully followed Hildebrand's teaching, this was Manichaeism applied to relations between church and state. The church, spiritual, was good. The state, material, was essentially the work of the devil. This naked political absolutism undermined the authority of kings. Taken seriously, his theories would lead to anarchy. Of course, the idea that the priesthood was higher than the kingship was not heretical and could find support in the Holy Fathers. However, the Fathers always allowed that emperors and kings had supremacy of jurisdiction in their own sphere, and had always insisted that the power of secular rulers comes from God and is worthy of the honor that befits every God-established institution. What was new, shocking and completely unpatristic in Gregory's words was his disrespect for the kingship, his refusal to allow it any dignity or holiness, still more, his proto-communist implication that rulers had no right to rule without the Pope's blessing. The corollary of this, of course, was that the only rightful ruler was the Pope. For if the Holy Apostolic See, through the princely power divinely conferred upon it, has jurisdiction over spiritual things, why not also over secular things? Thus, to the secular rulers of Spain, Gregory wrote in 1077, that the Kingdom of Spain belonged to St. Peter and the Roman Church in rightful ownership, and to the secular rulers of Sardinia he wrote in 1073 that the Roman Church exerted a special and individual care over them, which meant, as a later letter of 1080 demonstrated, that they would face armed invasion if they did not submit to the Pope's terms. Again, in 1075, he threatened King Philip of France with excommunication, having warned the French bishops that if the king did not amend his ways, he would place France under ban. Do not doubt that we shall, with God's help, make every possible effort to snatch the kingdom of France from his possession. This was no empty threat. Gregory had the ability to compel submission. He demonstrated this when he wrote to one of King Philip's vassals, Duke William of Aquitaine, and invited him to threaten the king. The king backed down. This power was demonstrated to an even greater extent in his famous dispute with Emperor Henry IV of Germany. It began with a quarrel between the Pope and the Emperor over who should succeed to the See of Milan. This was the see, significantly, whose most famous bishop, St. Ambrose, had excommunicated but not deposed an emperor, but had also declared that Rome had only a primacy of confession, not of honor. Gregory expected Henry to back down as King Philip had done, but he did not, no doubt because the See of Milan was of great importance politically, in that its lands and vassals gave it control of the Alpine passes and therefore of Henry's access to his Italian domains. Instead, in January 1076, he convened a synod of bishops at Worms, which addressed Gregory as Brother Hildebrand, demonstrated that his despotism had introduced mob rule into the church, and refused all obedience to him, since, as you publicly proclaimed, none of us has been to you a bishop. From now on you will be pope to none of us. Gregory retaliated in a truly revolutionary way. In a synod in Rome in February, he declared the emperor deposed. Addressing St. Peter, he said, "I withdraw the whole kingdom of the Germans and of Italy from Henry the King, son of Henry the Emperor, for he has risen up against thy church with unheard of arrogance, and I absolve all Christians from the bond of the oath which they have made to him or shall make, and I forbid anyone to serve him as king." By absolving subjects of their oath of allegiance to their king, Gregory effectively, as Robinson writes, sanctioned rebellion against the royal power. That lent Gregory published Dictatus Papae, which left no doubt about the revolutionary political significance of his actions, and which must be counted as one of the most megalomaniac documents in history. The Pope can be judged by no one. The Roman Church has never erred and never will err till the end of time. The Roman Church was founded by Christ alone. The Pope alone can depose bishops and restore bishops. He alone can make new laws, set up new bishoprics, and divide old ones. He alone can translate bishops. He alone can call general councils and authorize canon law. He alone can revise his own judgments. He alone can use the imperial insignia. He can depose emperors. He can absolve subjects from their allegiance. All princes should kiss his feet. His legates, even though in inferior orders, have precedence over all bishops. An appeal to the papal court inhibits judgment by all inferior courts. A duly ordained pope is undoubtedly made a saint by the merits of St. Peter. Robinson continues, "The confusion of the spiritual and the secular in Gregory VII's thinking is most marked in the terminology he used to describe the laymen whom he recruited to further his political aims. His letters are littered with the terms the warfare of Christ, the service of St. Peter, the vassals of St. Peter. Military terminology is, of course, commonly found in patristic writings. St. Paul had evoked the image of the soldier of Christ, who waged an entirely spiritual war. But, in the letters of Gregory VII, the traditional metaphor shades into literal actuality. For Gregory, the warfare of Christ and the warfare of St. Peter came to mean not the spiritual struggles of the faithful, nor the duties of the secular clergy, nor the ceaseless devotions of the monks, but rather the armed clashes of feudal knights on the battlefields of Christendom. This was power politics under the guise of an apolitical spirituality. But it worked. Although, at a synod in Worms in 1076, some bishops supported Henry, saying that the Pope had introduced worldliness into the Church, that the bishops have been deprived of their divine authority, and that the Church of God is in danger of destruction. Still, Henry began to lose support, and in 1077 he was forced to march across the Alps and do penance before Gregory, standing for 3 days almost naked in the snow outside the castle of Canossa. Gregory restored him to communion, but not to his kingship. Soon rebellion began to stir in Germany as Rudolf, Duke of Swabia, was elected anti-king. For a while Gregory hesitated, but then in 1080 he definitely deposed Henry, freed his subjects from their allegiance to him, and declared that the kingship was conceded to Rudolf. However, Henry recovered, convened a synod of bishops that declared Gregory deposed, and then convened another synod that elected an anti-pope, Wibert of Ravenna. In October 1080, Rudolf died in battle. Then, in 1083, Henry and Wibert marched on Rome. In 1084, Wibert was consecrated Pope Clement III, and in turn crowned Henry as emperor. Gregory fled from Rome with his Norman allies and died in Salerno in 1085. "I have loved righteousness and hated iniquity," he said. "Therefore I die in exile," said Gregory as he lay dying. But a monk who waited on him replied, "In exile thou canst not be, for God hath given thee the heathen for thine inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possession." This scripture refers to Christ, not a simple man. But then such distortion and blasphemy was becoming commonplace now, for, as Archimandrite Justin Popovich put it, human history has had 3 main falls, that of Adam, that of Judas, and that of the Pope. The fall of the Pope consists in seeking to replace the God-man with man. The King and the Church. Less spectacular than his struggle with Henry, but no less instructive, was Gregory's contest with King William I of England. As we have seen, William had conquered England with Hildebrand's blessing, and shortly after his bloody pacification of the country, he imposed the new canon law of the Reformed papacy upon the English Church. This pleased Gregory, who was therefore prepared to overlook the fact that William considered that he owed his kingdom to his sword, and God alone. The King of the English, although in certain matters he does not comport himself as devoutly as we might hope, nevertheless, in that he has neither destroyed nor sold the churches of God, that he has taken pains to govern his subjects in peace and justice, that he has refused his assent to anything detrimental to the apostolic see, even when solicited by certain enemies of the cross of Christ, and that he has compelled priests on oath to put away their wives and laity to forward the tithes they were withholding from us. In all these respects, he has shown himself more worthy of approbation and honour than other kings. The other kings Gregory was referring to included, first of all, the Emperor Henry IV of Germany, who, unlike William, did not support the Pope's reforms. If William had acted like Henry, then there is no doubt that Pope Gregory would have excommunicated him too. And if William had refused to cooperate with the papacy, then there is equally no doubt that the Pope would have incited his subjects to wage a holy war against him, as he did against Henry. For, as an anonymous monk of Hersfeld wrote, "The Gregorians say that it is a matter of the faith, and it is the duty of the faithful in the Church to kill and to persecute those who communicate with or support the excommunicated King Henry and refuse to promote the efforts of the Gregorian party." But William, by dint of brute force within and subtle diplomacy without, managed to achieve the most complete control over both church and state that any English ruler ever achieved. while at the same time paradoxically managing to remain on relatively good terms with the most autocratic pope in history. For totalitarian rulers only respect rivals of the same spirit. Thus did the Papacaesarist totalitarianism of Hildebrand beget the Caesaropapist totalitarianism of William the Bastard. The absolute nature of William's control of the Church was vividly expressed by Edmund of Canterbury. Now it was the policy of King William to maintain in England the usages and laws which he and his fathers before him were accustomed to have in Normandy. Accordingly, he made bishops, abbots, and other nobles throughout the whole country of persons of whom, since everyone knew who they were, from what estate they had been raised, and to what they had been promoted, it would be considered shameful ingratitude if they did not implicitly obey his laws, subordinating to this every other consideration, or if any one of them, presuming upon the power conferred by any temporal dignity, dared raise his head against him. Consequently, all things, spiritual and temporal alike, waited upon the nod of the king. He would not, for instance, allow any one in all his dominion, except on his instructions, to recognize the established pontiff of the city of Rome, or under any circumstance to accept any letter from him if it had not first been submitted to the king himself. Also, he would not let the primate of his kingdom, by which I mean the Archbishop of Canterbury, otherwise Daubernia if he were presiding over a general council of bishops, lay down any ordinance or prohibition unless these were agreeable to the king's wishes and had been first settled by him. Then again, he would not allow any one of his bishops, except on his express instructions, to proceed against or excommunicate one of his barons or officers for incest or adultery or any other cardinal offence, even when notoriously guilty, or to lay upon him any punishment of ecclesiastical discipline. Again, in a letter to the Pope in reply to the latter's demand for fealty, William wrote, "I have not consented to pay fealty, nor will I now, because I never promised it, nor do I find that any of my predecessors ever paid it to your predecessors." And in the same letter, he pointedly called Archbishop Lanfranc my vassal, i.e., not the Pope. On the other hand, he agreed to the Pope's demand for the payment of Peter's pence, the voluntary contribution of the English people to Rome, which had now become compulsory, for to squeeze the already impoverished English meant no diminution in his personal power. The popes therefore had to wait until William's death before gradually asserting their personal control over the English Church. In any case, William had already broken the back of the English people both physically and spiritually, and the totalitarian structure of Anglo-Norman government, combining secular and ecclesiastical hierarchies under the king, needed only the man at the top to change, to make it a perfectly functioning cog in the ruthless machine of the Vicar of Christ. We can express this in another way by saying that as a result of the Norman conquest, England became a feudal monarchy. For R.H.C., Davies explains that feudal monarchy was in fact a new Leviathan, the medieval equivalent of a socialist state. In a socialist state, the community owns, or should own, the means of production. In a feudal monarchy, the king did own all the land, which in the terms of medieval economy might fairly be equated with the means of production. The best and simplest example of a feudal monarchy is to be found in England after the Norman conquest. When William the Conqueror defeated Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings, 1066, he claimed to have established his legitimate right to succeed Edward the Confessor as King of England, but, owing to Harold's resistance, he was also able to claim that he had won the whole country by right of conquest. Henceforward, every inch of land was to be his, and he would dispose of it as he thought fit. As is well known, he distributed most of it to his Norman followers, but he did not give it to them in absolute right. The conqueror's ownership of the land was firmly established in Doomsday Book, which thereby became the record of the day of doom of the Orthodox Christian autocracy in the West. Professor Romanides sees William's victory as the victory of the Franco-Latin heretics of the French, German and North Italian lands over the West Roman Orthodox of Rome itself and the British Isles. The Franco-Latins had just completed the expulsion of the Roman Orthodox from the papacy in 1009, Namthorphav 1046. This was followed by William the Conqueror's capture of England in 1066 and by his appointment of the Lombard Lanfranc as the first Franco-Latin Archbishop of Canterbury with the blessing of the Lombard Pope Alexander II in 1070. Lanfranc and his Franco-Latin bishops got their apostolic succession by dismissing all their Celtic and Saxon predecessors en masse. They condemned them as heretics and schismatics and sentenced them to prison for life, where they were tortured and starved to death. Lanfranc's successor in 1093 was the Lombard Anselm of Canterbury, who was the chief exponent of the Franco-Latin positions at the dialogue between the Franco-Latins and the Roman Orthodox over the Filioque at Bari in 1098. The English diaspora. What influence did the Norman Papist conquest of England have on the destiny of the neighbouring British Orthodox churches? And what was the destiny of those English Orthodox who fled beyond the seas? Soon, the Norman Papist malaise spread to other parts of the British Isles. Scotland welcomed many of the English exiles fleeing from William, but it proved to be a temporary and illusory refuge. For King Malcolm's wife Margaret, though a very pious woman and an English princess of the old Wessex dynasty, became a spiritual daughter of Lanfranc, and hence the chief instrument of the Normanisation and papalization of the Scottish Church. However, according to Lucy Menzies, it was not till the time of David I, son of Malcolm and Margaret, that the authority of the Church of Rome was fully accepted in Scotland, and the Celtic Church, as such, disappeared from the mainland, the Culdees being driven out. Wales did not fare much better. After William's pilgrimage there in 1081, a struggle took place between the Gregorian and nationalist parties, whose outcome was easy to foresee. It seems likely that the last independent Orthodox bishop in Britain was Ridmarch of St. David's, son of Sulian the Wise, who reposed in 1096, and of whom the Annals of St. David's say that he was one without an equal or second, excepting his father, for learning, wisdom, and piety. And after Ridmarch instruction for scholars ceased at Menevia. Early in the next century, the Irish too suffered Papist reformation, and, in 1172, a Norman invasion. Their reaction to the news that their land had already been granted to the Normans by the English Pope Adrian IV is not recorded, for in his Metallogicus of 1156, John of Salisbury writes of Adrian, "At my solicitation, he granted Ireland to Henry II, the illustrious King of England, to hold by hereditary right, as his letter to this day testifies. For all Ireland of ancient right, according to the donation of Constantine, was said to belong to the Roman Church which he founded. Thus perished that church which had been so important in the evangelization of England, and which, in the person of St. Columbanus of Luxeuil, had given a classic rebuke to a heretical pope. If you err, then those who have always kept the orthodox faith, whoever they may have been, even if they seem to be your subordinates, shall be your judges. And thus, even as your honour is great in proportion to the dignity of your see, so great care is needful for you, lest you lose your dignity through some mistake. For power will be in your hands just so long as your principles remain sound. For he is the appointed key-bearer of the kingdom of heaven, who opens by true knowledge to the worthy and shuts to the unworthy. Otherwise, if he does the opposite, he shall be able neither to open nor to shut." Dr. Andrew Phillips writes that Alcin, abbot of St. Augustine's at Canterbury, took refuge in Norway. Sweden, where English missionaries had long been at work, was another destination, and perhaps Finland too. It was, however, Denmark which proved to be the most popular destination. It was from here that King Sweyn had thought to mount invasions in 1070 and 1075. These were supported in England, especially in the north and the east, where Danish sympathies were strong. Many churchmen also fled abroad, their places taken by the feudal warrior bishops and clergy of the Normans, such as Odo of Bayeux, who fought at Hastings. Scandinavia seems to have been their main destination. Other exiles went to the continent, to Flanders, France, and Italy. King Harold's daughter, Githa, moved further still. She was to marry the Grand Prince of Kiev, Vladimir, and lived in Kiev, then a great center of Christian civilization. Here, having been made welcome, she gave birth to several children, of whom the eldest son was named Harold, like his grandfather, but also received the Slavic name Mstislav. Possibly the greatest emigration, however, was elsewhere. The Old English were attracted above all by the almost mystical name of Constantinople, fixed, they believed, as Constantine had believed before them, at the middle of the earth, joining east and west, which Kipling wrongly said would never meet. It is certain that from the Conquest on, and especially during the 1070s but right on into the middle of the 12th century, huge numbers of English emigrated to the New Rome. Moreover, this emigration was an emigration of the elite of the country. The great scholar Sir Frank Stenton has discovered that several noble families simply disappeared after the Conquest, and they were not all killed at Hastings. They emigrated. It was particularly the young who left to seek a better future elsewhere. In historical terms, this emigration is comparable only to the emigration of the Russian elite and nobility in 1917 when confronted by the Bolshevik terror. So great was this emigration, especially it seems from the West Country, the Fens and East Anglia, and so long did it continue, that we must assume that it occurred with the approval of William I and his successors. It seems almost certain that it was their method of ridding themselves of the rebellious Old English ruling class and their supporters among the people. Exile, organized by the state, was after all a bloodless elimination of those who opposed William and the new order. It is no coincidence that the exodus continued right into the 12th century. Why did they choose Constantinople? First, because probably already in the Confessor's reign, let us not forget that he was also half Norman, discontented elements seem already to have left for Constantinople, where the emperor needed men to fight in his armies, especially against the Turks, who posed a threat in the east. Secondly, many Danes and other Scandinavians, such as Harald Hardrada, had formed the elite Varangian Guard there and found fame and fortune. News of this had certainly reached England. Thirdly, what was the future for a young English noble in Norman England? We know that in 1070, a certain Ioannis Raphaelis, an imperial agent or prospatharios, came to England recruiting for the imperial army. Young Englishmen and Anglo-Danes, especially those of noble birth, would certainly have been attracted. All the more so, since though the emperor faced the Turks in the east, in the west, especially in southern Italy, Sicily and Dalmatia, he faced the hated Normans. What better way for an Englishman of avenging himself? Fourthly, there were those who did not like the new order in the church or in the state under the Normans. Spiritually, they could find refuge in Constantinople and the freedom to continue to live in the ritual and the spirit of the Old English Church in the imperial capital. Perhaps unconsciously, their instincts and feelings drew them to that city which symbolized the unity of Christendom through the Old English period, and which had had so many connections with the apostles of the English, Gregory and Augustine. The contribution of the English exiles was immediately felt. Thus Stephen Lowe writes, Nikephoros Bryennios, writing in the first half of the 12th century, describes a palace coup in 1071. Emperor Romanos Diogenes owed his position to being stepfather to the legitimate Emperor Michael VII Ducas. After Romanos was defeated and captured by Seljuk Turks at the disastrous Battle of Manzikert, Michael seized the throne on his own account. Varangian guards were used as bully boys to overawe the opposition, and Bryennios implies that these palace guards were Englishmen, loyal from of old to the Emperor of the Romans. In 1075, continues Phillips, a fleet of 350 ships, according to another source 235, left England for exile in Micklegarth, the great city, Constantinople. The commander of this fleet was one Siward, or Sigurd, called Earl of Gloucester. It is not impossible that he is identical with Siward Barne, who had taken part in the Fenland uprising of 1071 with Hereward. With him sailed 2 other earls and 8 high-ranking nobles. If, at a conservative estimate, we accept the figure of 235 ships and place 40 people in each ship, this would indicate an exodus of nearly 10,000 people, and this was only one group, albeit by far the largest, which left these shores after 1066. When they arrived in Constantinople, they found the city under siege and, we are told, thereupon relieved the inhabitants, scattering the Turks before them. This relief, and it occurred, earned the gratitude of the emperor, and the English were granted lodging and places in the imperial army. The English were particularly valued since they were mostly young. Many were of noble birth, and they all loathed the Normans. The elite showed such loyalty that they entered the imperial household and formed the emperor's bodyguard. Their exemplary loyalty to the emperor of the Romans echoed the loyalty of the Old English to the pre-conquest papacy, to St. Gregory the Great, Pope of the Romans. We read of English troops fighting at Dyrrhachium, Durazzo, in 1081, where they suffered heavy losses against the Normans. Again, in the 1080s, the emperor granted the English land on the Gulf of Nicomedia, near Nicaea, to build a fortified town known as Civotus. We are told that from the great fleet of 1075, some 4,300 English settled in the city itself, which at that time was the most populous, advanced and cosmopolitan city in the world. Further, we read that the English sent priests to Hungary, which was then in close contact with Constantinople, for them to be consecrated bishops, since the English preferred the Latin rite to the Greek rite of St. Paul. According to the sources, far more English than the 4,300 who settled in the city went further still. With the blessing of Emperor Alexis, these went on to recolonize territories lost by the empire. It is said that they sailed on from the city to the north and the east for 6 days. Then they arrived at the beginning of the Scythian country. Here they found a land called Domapia, which they renamed New England. Here they founded towns, and having driven out the invaders, they reclaimed them for the empire. Moreover, they renamed the towns London, York, and called others after the towns where they had come from. After painstaking research, it has been discovered that medieval maps list no fewer than 6 towns with names suggesting English settlements. These settlements on maps of the 14th to 16th centuries are located along the northern coast of the Black Sea. One of the names appears as Suzaco, possibly from Saxon. Another town, situated some 110 miles to the east of the Straits of Kerch, near the Sea of Azov, appears variously as Londia, Londin, and Londina. On the 12th century Syrian map, the Sea of Azov itself is called the Varang Sea, the Sea of the Varangians, a name used for the English in Constantinople at this period. It is known that in the 13th century a Christian people called the Saxi, and speaking a language very similar to Old English, inhabited this area, and that troops of the Saxi served in the Georgian army in the 12th century. There seem to be too many coincidences for us to think that the Sea of Azov was not then the first New England. Stephen Lowe writes, Jocelyn's Miracula Sancti Augustini Episcopos Cantuariensis tells of an Englishman of high rank from Canterbury who obtained such favour with the emperor and empress that he received a dukedom over wise soldiers and a large part of the auxiliaries. He married a rich woman of high family and had a church built in Constantinople dedicated to Saints Nicholas and Augustine of Canterbury. This church was popular with the English in Byzantium and became the chapel of the Varangians. Another report tells of a monk of Canterbury named Joseph, who visited Constantinople in about 1090 on his return from a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. He found there a number of his own countrymen and recognized friends of his own among them. They were now in the imperial household and were friends of the officer in charge of guarding holy relics. The Historia Monasterii de Abingdon records that in the reign of Henry I, an Englishman named Ulfric, from Lincoln in the Danelaw, arrived on a mission from Emperor Alexios. The purpose is not stated, but it may have been a further attempt to hire mercenaries. The Byzantine chronicler Kinomos, writing about 1180-3 of the actions of Emperor John II at the Battle of Barrow of 1122, describes the axe-bearers who stood around him. They are a Britannic people who of old served the Roman emperors. Inglinois English were present at the disastrous Battle of Myriokephalon in 1185. However, by this late stage, these Englishmen, whom Emperor Manuel describes as some of the leading men of the nobility of England, were more likely to have been Anglo-Normans than Saxon exiles. In 1204, the Frankish army of the Fourth Crusade, diverted from its original aim to attack Muslim Egypt, instead besieged and captured Christian Constantinople. Nicetas Choniates was a Roman chronicler of the fighting that led to the city's fall. He writes that an attempted landing near the palace of Vlachanae was repulsed by Pisan mercenaries and the axe-bearing barbarians. The Frankish eyewitness and chronicler Robert de Clary, describing the battle, tells of the English, Danish and Greeks defending the towers with axes and swords. The Frankish crusader de Villardouin reports the walls being manned by English and Danes, and that the fighting was very violent with axes and swords. One of the negotiators sent to the emperor de Villardouin describes walking past Englishmen and Danes, fully armed with their axes, posted at the gate of the city and all the way along to the palace. There are few mentions of the Varangian Guard after the city's fall, and it is thought they dwindled to a shadow of their former glory. However, traces of the English Varangians still remained. Emperor Michael VIII, 1261–1282, who recaptured Constantinople after the Frankish Empire collapsed, refers to the active and repeated use of his Englino-Varangoi in defending his reduced Byzantine realm. The 14th century De Officiis of Pseudocodinus states that English was used in the acclamation to the emperor at the imperial banquet at Christmas. After the Genoese, Pisans and Venetians came the Inglinisti, clashing their weapons with a loud noise. Phillips continues, as for those thousands of Old English who settled in the great city itself, they may have lived in a quarter known as Vlanger, from Varangian, near the Sea of Marmara. In Constantinople, we know of a church of St. Olaf, though this was probably for Scandinavians rather than Anglo-Danes. Perhaps the most lasting image of the English Orthodox in exile is Anna Komnena's description of their last stand against the Normans at the Battle of Durazzo, present-day Albania, in 1081. The axe-bearing barbarians from the Isle of Thule, as Anna called them, thrust back an attack on their part of the line, and then pursued the Normans into the sea up to their necks. But they had advanced too far, and a Norman cavalry attack threw them back again. It seems that in their tired condition they were less strong than the Celts, Normans. At any rate, the barbarian force was massacred there, except for survivors who fled for safety to the sanctuary of the Archangel Michael. All who could went inside the building. The rest climbed to the roof and stood there, thinking that would save their lives. The Latins merely set fire to them and burned the lot, together with the sanctuary. Thus did the chant of the English Orthodox warriors, Holy Cross, fall silent on earth. And thus did the Lord accept their sacrifice as a whole burnt offering to himself in heaven. May Michael the standard-bearer Lead them into the holy light, which thou didst promise of old to Abraham and his seed. The death of the tyrant. Returning, finally, to England, the scene towards the end of William's reign in 1087 is one of almost unrelieved gloom. As Eadmer writes, "How many of the human race have fallen on evil days? The sons of kings and dukes and the proud ones of the land are fettered with manacles and irons, and in prison and in jail. How many have lost their limbs by the sword or disease, have been deprived of their eyes, so that when released from prison, the common light of the world is a prison for them. They are the living dead for whom the sun, mankind's greatest pleasure, now has set. Blessed are those who are consoled by eternal hope, and afflicted are the unbelieving, for deprived of all their goods and also cut off from heaven, their punishment has now begun. Judgment begins at the house of God, I Peter 4:17, and God's judgment was indeed very heavy on the formerly pious English land, especially on the north, which had refused to help Harold, and which was devastated with extraordinary cruelty by William. But then God takes his vengeance even on the instruments of his wrath, Isaiah 10:15. Thus, when William was dying, as the Norman monk Ordericus Vitalis recounts, his conscience tormented for his deeds, I appoint no one my heir to the crown of England, but leave it to the disposal of the eternal Creator, whose I am, and who ordereth all things. For I did not obtain that high honour by hereditary right, but wrested it from the perjured king in a desperate battle, with much effusion of human blood, and it was by the slaughter and banishment of his adherents that I subjugated England to my rule. I have persecuted its native inhabitants beyond all reason. Whether gentle or simple, I have cruelly oppressed them. Many I unjustly disinherited. Innumerable multitudes, especially in the county of York, perished through me by famine or the sword. Thus it happened. The men of Dara and other people beyond the Humber called in the troops of Sweyn, King of Denmark, as their allies against me, and put to the sword Robber Comyn and 1,000 soldiers within the walls of Durham, as well as others, my barons and most esteemed knights, in various places. These events inflamed me to the highest pitch of resentment, and I fell on the English of the northern shires like a ravening lion. I commanded their houses and corn, with all their implements and chattels, to be burnt without distinction, and large herds of cattle and beasts of burden to be butchered wherever they were found. It was thus that I took revenge on the multitudes of both sexes by subjecting them to the calamity of a cruel famine, and by so doing, alas, became the barbarous murderer of many thousands, both young and old, of that fine race of people. Having, therefore, made my way to the throne of that kingdom by many crimes, I dare not leave it to anyone but God alone, lest after my death worse should happen by my means. But this confession evidently was not enough to expiate his guilt in the eyes of God, for as Thierry writes, following Ordericus Vitalis, the events surrounding his burial showed that the mark of Cain was on him still. His medical and other attendants, who had passed the night with him, seeing that he was dead, hastily mounted their horses and rode off to take care of their property. The serving men and vassals of inferior rank, when their superiors had fled, carried off the arms, vessels, clothes, linen, and other movables, and fled likewise, leaving the corpse naked on the floor. The king's body was left in this situation for several hours. At length some of the clergy, clerks and monks, having recovered the use of their faculties and collected their strength, arrayed a procession. Clad in the habits of their order, with crosses, tapers, and censers, they approached the corpse and prayed for the soul of the deceased. The Archbishop of Rouen, named Guillaume, ordered the king's body to be conveyed to Caen and buried in the Basilica of St. Stephen, the first martyr, which he had built in his lifetime. But his sons, his brothers, all his relatives, were afar off. Not one of his officers was present, not one offered to take charge of his obsequies, and an obscure countryman named Herluin, through pure good nature, and for the love of God, say the historians, took upon himself the trouble and expense. He hired a cart and attendants, had the body conveyed to the port on the Seine, from thence on a barge down the river, and by sea to Caen. Gilbert, abbot of St. Stephen's, with all his monks, came to meet the coffin, and was joined by many clerks and laymen, but a fire suddenly appearing, broke up the procession. The inhumation of the great chief, the famous Baron, as the historians of the time call him, was interrupted by fresh occurrences. On that day were assembled all the bishops and abbots of Normandy. They had the grave dug in the church, between the altar and the choir. The mass was finished, and the body was about to be lowered, when a man rose up amid the crowd, and said, with a loud voice, "Clerks and bishops, this ground is mine. Upon it stood the house of my father. The man for whom you pray wrested it from me to build on it his church. I have neither sold my land, nor pledged it, nor forfeited it, nor given it. It is my right. I claim it. In the name of God, I forbid you to put the body of the spoiler there, or to cover it with my earth." He who thus lifted up his voice was Asselin, son of Arthur, and all present confirmed the truth of his words. The bishops told him to approach, and making a bargain with him, delivered to him 60 souls as the price of the place of sepulture only, and engaged to indemnify him equitably for the rest of the ground. On this condition, it was the corpse of the vanquisher of the English was received into the ground, dug for its reception. At the moment of letting it down, it was discovered that the stone coffin was too narrow. The assistants attempted to force the body, and it burst. Incense and perfumes were burned in abundance, but without avail. The people dispersed in disgust, and the priests themselves, hurrying through the ceremony, soon deserted the church.